welcome back to another episode of History Hack. You know, I've got to do our little housekeeping bit, so bear with me. You can leave us a 5-star review on Apple. You can put anything you like in the comment section. Chris has ginger hair. Alex is awesome. Alina is badass. Whatever you like, we need to get other people to see our podcast. We also have a new website, www.historyhack.co.uk. You will find, hopefully soon, some of our merch. All our bios are already up there, and previous episodes if you want to go and have a listen. You can also get us a one-off donation on Ko-fi, which is ko-fi.com/historyhack. I need to buy new shelving units. That would be really helpful if people start giving us a bit of a donation, because I've got way too many books at the moment and everything's on the floor. It looks absolutely ridiculous. If you really, really, really like us, you can subscribe to our Patreon, which is www.patreon.co.uk/historyhack. If you are a Patreon supporter, you'll already know that 2 episodes have gone out already for our lovely, lovely people that support us. On D-Day, we had a release of 2 episodes on D-Day, so if you're super into that, go head over and have a listen and become a Patreon supporter. Or you can always be our super Patreon supporter and get a lock of Chris's hair, limited time only. Anyway, we are here. We're going to go down the ancient route. Forget World War II, forget 20th century history. We've done enough of that. Now it's time for us to go back to the ancients. And I've got us a recurring guest. You probably heard her a couple of months back. And she's back to talk to us about female gladiators. Alexandra Sills is back with us. Hi.
Hello.
So excited. You're finally back. We did promise everybody you'd come back, and now you're back.
I am excited. I am thrilled to be back.
But we're not going to talk about gladiators or Greek gladiators this time. We're going to talk about women. Women are something completely and utterly different. You kind of think of a Xena kind of gladiator when you see one, don't you?
Yeah, of course. I always love that scene in Gladiator where they've got the female gladiators on chariots with the bows and arrows, and one gets cut in half with a big blade on a wheel from one of the chariots. Brilliant scene. Yeah, it definitely stirs the imagination.
Well, let's talk about that then. Let's talk about what we do see here and there about female gladiators. Because, like you said, woman gets cut in half. I imagine Xena, and probably most likely they've got armor left, right, and center, and they're badass, hardcore women.
Yeah. No. Unfortunately. I think there's so many female gladiators in like TV shows and movies, especially if you think about like the ones that have gone into sci-fi and fantasy genres, like Katniss Everdeen. She's technically a female gladiator when you think about it. And we think, oh wow, this is, taken from history. Not so much. So we don't actually have a single source that specifies that women fought definitely in the Colosseum for a start. And actually, the evidence is really, really slim for female gladiators.
What evidence do we have? Is there any sort of evidence out there that points to women doing something? Are there any sources? Is there anything?
There's actually a load of sources that talk about women in arenas. So there is a bunch of evidence actually. But the problem is that quite often the writers will say there was a woman in the arena, and everyone takes that as arena equals gladiator. They must be gladiators. The issue with this is that the arena wasn't just for gladiators. There were loads of reasons why a woman might be in the arena. So, for instance, the beast fights and the hunts. They happened generally in the morning of a show, and you would see all kinds of animals from all around the empire and a bunch of people hunting them and fighting them. And you see that in the movies as well, for instance, Maximus and his tiger. But the thing is, those aren't technically gladiators that do that. There's a specific type of fighter. There's a bestiarius and there's a venator, and they're all to do with the animals. So we do have lots of mentions of women doing this job, but it's not technically being a gladiator. So that's a bit different. And you've also got writers saying there were women in the arena. For instance, I think it was Tacitus says there were women in the arena disgracing themselves. But he doesn't actually say what they were doing that was disgracing themselves. They could have been hunting, but they could also have been musicians, because we know that there was music in the amphitheatre. There would have been music all throughout the day to entertain the crowds. There could possibly have been dancers as well, so they could have been dancing. Women were executed along with men in the arena. There was one particular story, for instance, in the opening of the Colosseum in 80 CE, where they had a series of executions that were supposed to copy myths, which is kind of cruel when you think about it. So, for instance, you had a guy who was dressed up as Orpheus playing his lyre, because the story goes that Orpheus was able to tame wild beasts with the beauty of his music. And they let a load of animals into the arena. And this poor guy isn't actually a lyre player, he's some kind of criminal and gets torn to pieces by the animals. There's stories, for instance, of women having these kind of massive executions. One was called Pacify. And if you know the story, Pacify was the mother of the Minotaur. And she got pregnant by partnering up with a bull. So her execution, this new Roman Pacify, was to be gored by a bull in the Colosseum. And everyone laughs, ha ha ha, she's not going to get pregnant. She's dead. Very funny, very Roman. So there's loads of reasons why a woman might be in the arena, not necessarily gladiators. So, for instance, we've got at least two writers talking about those opening games at the Colosseum specifically, which lasted 100 days, so it's massive, thousands and thousands of performers. Neither of those mention women doing the job of gladiator. They're all talking about executions and hunting, which is a bit different. The hunters, particularly, they had separate training. They lived separately from the gladiators. They never met each other apart from backstage on the day. So it's a bit difficult to say that there's female gladiators in that way. We do have a couple of stories, for instance, the Emperor Nero. And this is before the Colosseum is built. So you've got to imagine it in a kind of
Yay, Nero, our crazy man.
oh, yeah, it's definitely a crazy story. Imagine before the Colosseum is built. So in Rome, we don't know exactly where this happened. It either happened in a temporary amphitheatre or one that burnt down in the Great Fire, or it happened in the Circus Maximus, which was also occasionally used for gladiators and beast hunts when it needed to be, because you've got a massive circus, it's already there, why not use it? He killed his mum. He murdered his mum, Agrippina, but he couldn't let anyone know that he'd murdered her. So he had to put on a show of how sad he was that she was dead. And the way that you did this in Rome was to present gladiators at games. Because gladiators started off as a kind of funerary thing. You had a funeral, you were saying goodbye to the person, you'd have a couple of gladiators fight at the funeral. And that was how the tradition started. So he decided to show how sad he was that his mum had died in inexplicable circumstances. He decided that he was going to put on these massive games. And we've got Cassius Dio telling us about this. And he tells us that very aristocratic ladies were forced into the games to compete. Now, again, he doesn't actually say how they were competing. Maybe they were fighting each other. We're not really sure. And this is about 5960 CE. So Nero is forcing these very, very posh ladies into the arena to fight something. Um, and this was the way that he showed that he was, distraught that his mum had died, was by making all the senators' wives hold a sword and shove them out in front of a crowd. Now, can we call them gladiators if they are fighting each other? The jury's out on this. Some people will say yes. I personally say no, because the thing that makes a gladiator is the fact that they are experts. They have trained every day for over a year if you're a beginner. Some of these guys have been training every day for over a decade. They are honed to perfection. They know exactly what they're doing. They have very specific tactics and a very particular fighting style. If you're going to throw a couple of posh women in because you're making a point to their husbands about the power that you have over them, and you hold the lives of their wives in your hand, I don't think you can call those women gladiators. I think you can call them victims of a maniac.
I totally agree. I totally agree because when you see, and I'm going to bring up Spartacus. I love Spartacus. I really
Yeah,
don't
go for
care,
it.
but you can see and you watch, how Spartacus trains, and even the series beforehand. You see and you watch how they develop and how they learn their own skills. Like they use a trident instead of using a sword, and blah 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 blah
Hmm.
blah blah, and whatever. And they learn different fighting skills and whatnot. How do you expect? Posh women who probably have never held a sword or even looked at a sword in their lives
Yeah.
to be classed as a gladiator. They are just a bunch of probably terrified women who have no choice but to wave around a sword, probably like they'd wave around, I don't know, their finger to tell people what to do in the household.
Yeah, exactly. I liken it to, karaoke. You take someone who's singing karaoke in a club badly, or in, some grotty little pub in the middle of nowhere, and
That's
then
me, by the way.
yeah, me too, to be honest. And then you transport them to Wembley Arena in front of hundreds of thousands of people and say, "Okay, here's your mic, go." Just because they can sing crap karaoke doesn't mean that they're going to be able to entertain, an arena crowd. It's the same kind of thing. Gladiators took great pride in the training that they took because they were the best of the best. In fact, we know that the Roman army on several occasions invited gladiators and gladiator trainers to teach the legions some new tips and tricks, which is really interesting. Come and give my boys some training so that they can go out and fight some barbarians. So they are recognized experts in their field. So personally, for me, to call these women gladiators is to, in a way, insult the gladiators themselves. But also, it's insulting to the women. We shouldn't be seeing them as, celebrity fighters. They were probably terrified. And, we see this time and time and again, women in the arena being thrown in. It's not because they're there to fight and to show off how talented they are. It's because some psychopath emperor is trying to make a point.
Yeah, no, no, no. I agree. I'm 100% on your side at this point. And whatever
Yeah.
historian kind of goes against that, you're putting, I don't know, again, modern day sort of values onto ancient history because
Mm.
you nowadays you probably could find women that be like that would just grab a sword. I mean, if there was a zombie apocalypse outside, I'd gladly grab a sword and just go for it. You know what I
Yeah,
mean? You got no
exactly.
choice. But women back in they were so pampered. They had everything handed to them. Senators' wives, I mean, God, they had staff and everybody that would do everything for them. They never had to lift a bloody finger.
Yeah, exactly. And again, you've got to understand gladiators in Rome were seen as the best of the best at what they did. But to justify being able to have fun watching them die, the Roman solution to the kind of guilt that you may feel making someone die a horrible death for your entertainment, their solution was to make gladiators the lowest social class possible. And this is called infamia, which is where we get the word infamous from.
Mm.
They were famous, but not for a great reason. And other people who had infamia in ancient Rome were sex workers and actors and charioteers and funeral directors and pimps. So it wasn't exactly a class that you wanted to belong to. You might cheer these people in the arena, but you certainly wouldn't want to be seen dead next to them in the pub or invite them over to dinner. You didn't want to be close to them, even though you admired them. So for these women to suddenly be categorized amongst the cheapest sex worker in Rome, it was a huge insult to them and to their husbands, and everyone in that arena would have known it. So, yeah, there is some scholarship that talks about female gladiators and includes these women that we know from these anecdotes. And it really grinds my gears because I'm thinking to myself, they're not gladiators. And it's insulting to both gladiators and the women to say so. They're victims. So yeah, that's the way. If everyone gets one thing from this podcast, it's that those women deserved better.
I've got a question for you. It's off topic, but on topic at the same time. I can't remember if we discussed this in the last podcast because we recorded so long ago. But when it comes down to gladiators, the evidence, I'm going to start talking about archaeological evidence because
Hmm.
when you talk about slaves, there's like practically no archaeological evidence. There is, but it's minute.
Mm.
With gladiators, you're kind of going along the similar lines. There is evidence, but there isn't evidence. Do we have any? Has anything been found that you know of to do with archaeological evidence for female gladiators?
Yeah, so we have two things. One is an inscription from Ostia, which was put up by a local politician called Hostilianus. And it's boasting of all the things that he's done for the town of Ostia, which was the port town of Rome. So it's quite close. And he says, amongst all this stuff that I've done, one of the things is I am the first to provide women for the sword. So this inscription is, here's all the cool stuff I've done, and one of them is, this is the general consensus anyway, I've provided female gladiators for the first time ever in Ostia. Now again, I'm going to pour cold water on it. Provided women for the sword doesn't actually tell us much about what the women were doing. Because again, this could be I was the first person to execute women by the sword. So in the Roman world, we have to remember that there wasn't really a police force and there wasn't such thing as a prison system. If you wanted justice, you went about it a slightly different way. So for victims of a crime, they they got their sense of justice by watching punishments such as executions. And this includes women. The Christians were particularly annoyed about it because a lot of female Christians were martyred in the Colosseum and arenas around the empire. So it could be that he was the first person to execute women. It was an important facet of spectacle for Romans because if your house is burgled or your cousin is murdered, this is the only justice you're going to get, is watching the person get skewered by a sword or eaten by an animal. That's the justice that you're going to receive. So it was a very important thing for the Romans to see justice being served. So when Hostilianus says he provided women for the sword, it doesn't necessarily mean that they were fighters. So there's that one inscription. And then we have one piece of art, and that comes from Halicarnassus, which is now known as Bodrum in Turkey. Now, if you remember what we were talking about the last time I was here about Greek gladiators, they're the jazzy gladiators, they're the ones that are covered in glitter with feather boas. We have this single piece of art from Halicarnassus, which has got two women on it, and they're fighting. And the thing that gets me here is that they are actually in the correct equipment that's clearly been made for them, designed for them. Correct equipment is very important because it shows that they actually are presenting themselves as knowing what they're doing. And in the artwork, they are both in a very correct stance, like a defensive stance that we see in the similar artwork to the men around as well. So if it wasn't for their names being inscribed on the stone, at first glance you might think that they were men. It's not something where they're showing their bodies off and it's like a sexy, here I am, I'm a gladiator. They are actually, they look like they mean business. And their names are so cool because their names are Amazon and Achillea. And Amazons, as we know from Wonder Woman, Amazons were the ancient race of warrior women. And Achillea is the feminization of the name Achilles, who we all know from the Iliad, played by Brad Pitt in that awful film. And there's a cool story from the Trojan War. So everyone knows of the Iliad, but the Iliad tells about 2 weeks worth of the story of a war that took 10 years. So there's more poems in the Trojan War story. We call it the epic cycle. And in the bit that comes immediately after the Iliad, which is called the Aethiopis, there's a story of Achilles. He's on the battlefield again, and this time the Amazons have decided to join the battle on behalf of the Trojans. And Achilles is fighting one of the key Amazon warriors, Penthesilea, and they have an epic battle. And finally, he manages to deal the fatal blow. And I think her helmet falls off as she's dying, and he looks into her eyes and realizes, oh no, I have fallen in love with that who I have just killed. And she dies in his arms, also loving him back for some reason, I guess, which isn't exactly, the meet cute that you'd expect from a romance story.
I love that. It's like, why would you? Sorry, I'm about to kill you, but I really love you.
Oh, I wish I hadn't stabbed you in the belly. Yeah, so so it's a well-known story from the Trojan War that Achilles stabbed this Amazon Penthesilea and then immediately falls in love with her and is devastated that she's dead. So this stone with these two gladiators on it, calling themselves Amazon because Penthesilea was an Amazon, and Achillea. I can imagine. Can you not imagine the crowds in Halicarnassus in the theatre watching this fight, thinking, oh, "Okay, there's a little, yeah, this reminds me of the story. There's kind of sexual undertones there. They look like they fancy each other."
I was
I
about to say they're going to fall into each other's arms, and then I don't know. My mind has gone a bit skew with there, but it is. I understand the whole sexual undertone. There is that two women, they're going to fall into each other's arms and declare their love for each other or something.
I mean, Eastern gladiators, they loved to choose names from myths so that you could see your favourite battles kind of recreated. But the fact that they chose Amazon and Achillea to fight each other, it adds kind of extra layer. And the thing with the stones from these Eastern gladiators is that most of them are gravestones. This one, we think, came from a tomb monument of a Munerarius, and that's the person who's putting on the show, not necessarily the owner. In fact, it's not usually the owner of the gladiators. It's probably a politician or a local priest of the imperial cult. And what they would do on their own memorial is, like Hostilianus, they would display all the cool things that they have done for the local population. And some of them, it was, while they were still alive, vote for me, I'm the guy that does this. And a lot of these guys, if they put on gladiatorial shows, would then put the most famous fights that they'd provided in art form so that every time someone walks up past their grave, they'll go, oh, yeah, that was the guy that put on that fight between those two women. That guy was cool. And it kind of reflects the glory of the fight back onto the politician that provided it. And we see these monuments all over, particularly Asia Minor. So we think that this stone comes from one of those. Unfortunately, the stone itself, it's really cool. You should go and see it if possible. It's in the British Museum now, because of course it is.
Oh, I didn't even know. Where is it in the British Museum? Have I missed it?
It's upstairs in the Roman room. They've got a little section of gladiators, and it's on the end of the display cabinet, and it's a beautiful stone. But of course, you know, as with so much in the British Museum, it came over in the Victorian period, and we don't really know much about it other than it comes from Halicarnassus. So we do know that in Turkey they put gladiators in reliefs on theatres and stadiums to kind of, this is what happens here, so we're going to put a big poster of it on the building. And there's also these monuments by the people putting on the shows. unfortunately, because we don't know whether it came from the theatre or whether it came from a necropolis, we've we've we have to make an educated guess. So I'm going to say I think it came from a funerary monument of the politician, because there's not a lot of artwork from the Halicarnassus Theatre. So thank you, British Museum, for giving us absolutely no
I was
context
gonna say,
whatsoever.
thanks very much to the Victorians for being so shit at documenting all the things that they've been finding.
But yeah, I mean, that's the only piece of artwork that we have. The context given, that the type of artwork that it is, the fact that they're choosing names from myths is a thing that we also see from the rest of Greece and Turkey. That tracks as well. Everything is telling us this is probably a really noteworthy fight that the politician wants to be remembered for. There were others, for instance, in Hierapolis, there was a fight between, I think it was Calydon and Odysseus, and theirs was a really, really dramatic fight. So they've got it in like a comic strip style along that monument, and we can see the phases of the fight. So we know that they were doing this so that people could remember and, you know, the highlight reel of a particularly popular games. So yeah, everything is telling us that this was definitely a real fight that everyone in Halicarnassus would have remembered and enjoyed remembering, and that the politician was so proud of that he wanted it to be remembered forever. And it is, because it happened, 1800 or so years ago, and I'm here talking about it today. So he did a good job being memorable. So yeah, as far as archaeology goes, that's about it. We don't have much osteoarchaeological evidence. We've only got really two cemeteries for gladiators. There's one in York, there's one in Ephesus. None of them had a woman. There was a skeleton found in London about 15 years ago in Dover Street, and it was a skeleton of a woman in her sarcophagus, and she had a terracotta lamp with a gladiator on it. And everyone
Mm.
said, "Oh yeah, she's a gladiator then, isn't she?"
Oh, yeah,
Well,
uh-huh.
no, because they were handing out these lamps with gladiators on and little terracotta dollies of gladiators, and you could have mosaics of gladiators in your house. All it means is she probably really enjoyed going and had bought it as a souvenir.
But it's basically like if I got buried with one of those, needles, for example, and they're now gonna say I'm a doctor. I'm a doctor because I got buried with a frigging needle.
Yeah,
It's basically the same thing.
exactly. It's, I think, with so much, and it really happens a lot with gladiators, is that we get so excited about gladiators because they're weird to us and they're unusual, that we kind of get carried away and we start making generalizations. So if someone has a lamp with them in their tomb that's got a gladiator on it, that must mean they're a gladiator. And we do it with loads of stuff. So, for instance, the osteoarchaeology in Ephesus, they found that the skeletons had really high traces of strontium in their bones, and they worked out, in the literary references, they found reference to a drink that was made with ash, and if you drank it, it helped with bone strength.
Hmm.
And they worked out all of these gladiators must have been drinking it. They've got well healed bones, because gladiators, we know, had wonderful doctors wherever possible, because they were a considerable expense. You didn't want to, waste all that training only for them to get a small cut and then die of an infection. So they had excellent medical care. And in Ephesus, we can see lots of bones have healed nicely. So if they're drinking this, it would help with bone strength and help with bone healing. Because we found this in Ephesus, you will find some scholars, not the good ones, saying, oh, all gladiators drank ash drinks, right? Well, no, because they've found gladiators in York and they're not having high strontium levels. So what we can say is they were drinking ash in Ephesus. Galen, who was a very famous doctor in the ancient world and actually trained by being a gladiatorial doctor. So he was seeing all of these cuts and all of these horrible injuries and using them as a learning experience, because where else do you get such a good opportunity to see inside people when they've, been disemboweled? He says, for instance, that they eat beans where he was. He was a gladiator doctor in Pergamon in Turkey. He fed them beans as a diet. So people have said, oh, well, all gladiators must eat beans. What he's saying is, mine do. We can't prove otherwise. Pliny tells a story that gladiators were known as barley men because they all ate so much barley. But when you look at what he's saying, and it's quoted in Galen, what he's actually saying is gladiators were known as barley men, past tense. Pliny the Elder, I mean, he died in the Vesuvius eruption at Pompeii, so we know he died in 79 CE. That's quite early in the story of gladiators, to be honest. So if he's already saying past tense they were all eating barley, we know that they weren't by 79 CE. And when Galen talks more about this story, he says, yeah, they were called barley men in Athens, but now everyone knows, supposedly, that gladiators all ate barley all the time throughout the whole empire for the entirety of Roman history. No, what we're saying is in one city, they were famous for being given a diet of barley. And this goes for all kinds of things with particularly gladiators because we get so overexcited. And this is one of them. We found one piece of art with women on it, and we've got one um, one story from a writer who said for this occasion, gladiators were women as well as men who had received some training and knew what they were doing. So we've got one literary reference and one piece of artistic reference, and everyone's gone absolutely crazy and said, yeah, that must mean that there were female gladiators everywhere.
So the bottom line of this is that it's possible, but very, very rare.
Incredibly rare. And when it comes to gladiatorial games, when the writers are writing about it, if something is unusual, they do not shut up about it because they loved novelty, that's true. So when something was novel, they mention it a lot. And they don't mention female gladiators. So, well, not a lot anyway. And when they are mentioning women, as we've seen, it's usually because they're being executed or because they're hunting animals, which is an entirely different skill set, or, they're being humiliated by a psychopath emperor.
Or embarrassing themselves, as they would say. Not that we would say it's embarrassment, but to them in those days it would be.
Disgracing themselves. Tacitus is such a nerd. Yeah, disgracing themselves.
It's
So
but disgracing themselves to these days is crying because someone is about to put a sword to your neck, or there's an animal that's about to be eating your face. Apparently, that's being disgraceful.
yeah, I mean, how embarrassing for them to put themselves in that situation. Oh yeah, it wasn't them putting themselves in the situation. Um, yeah, and we see it again and again. If you take something at face value and kind of blow it up, then it doesn't work. You need to look closely at what they are really saying. So, for instance, there was a poem by Statius, and he mentions female gladiators, and he says they fight like Amazons, but he then also says, but they're not trained and they are ignorant of weaponry. That's not being a gladiator. So yeah, it's really frustrating to see, especially in scholarship, all of these examples being put forward as yes, female gladiators existed, when everything is telling us not really.
So women more or less existed that were given a sword to fight, which probably would have been good for entertainment purposes. Let's find some slave women who have no other option, give them a sword and give them some armor and let them fight.
I mean, there absolutely was a form of entertainment in the arena that was making people fight for the purposes of laughing at them. and we know that. And it was a form of execution. So, for instance, if you were found, well, you weren't even found guilty of a crime mostly, because most of these guys weren't having a proper trial. If you were thrown in to be executed, there were a number of ways that they could do it. They could burn you, they could have you killed by an animal, they could simply stab you, but that wasn't a lot of fun. Crucifixion took a bit too long for the arena because this was supposed to be the lunchtime kind of midway show. So crucifixion's a bit rare. It did happen occasionally, but it could take a while, so it would have to be, helped
But it's
along.
boring for them. They want entertainment.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the ways that you could do this was you could dress up the criminal as a kind of jokey gladiator and make them fight each other. Now, you wouldn't usually send them in front of one of the trained gladiators because, frankly, the gladiators had other things to be doing and they were a bit above this. It wasn't unknown, but it was far more fun to give criminals some weapons and make them fight each other. And then whoever died, you just send another one on,
Like Spartacus. They did
like in
exactly the
Spartacus.
same thing in Spartacus.
Exactly. Some of them might be blindfolded for a bit of fun. They were called the Andabatai. You send them in with blindfolds on and make them try and stab each other. Because these aren't guys that you're watching to appreciate skill. These are guys who have done something awful to a member of your community and you want to see justice being done. So, yeah, we know that people were thrown in as a kind of joke version of a gladiator so that they could be laughed at and so that you could take genuine enjoyment out of watching them suffer. For the posh women, I mean, the writers, when they talk about it, they're horrified that the women are being sent in there. They can't really say anything too specific because they don't want to get in trouble themselves, but they're not happy to see respectable women being treated this way. That kind of treatment is reserved for foreigners, enslaved people, and criminals. So, yeah, it's a really knotty subject, and it can get really frustrating when you see all these lists of, you know, BuzzFeed, etc., that kind of thing. Female gladiators existed. We need to look at what was happening in the arena more carefully to kind of work out who was actually doing what and who was there because they were immensely talented and who was there because, they were there to suffer.
Do you think that we're so obsessed with this idea of female gladiators, we want it so bad because you wouldn't see even nowadays. I mean, I guess you do. You have very inspirational women that are really truly badass, that we want something like that from ancient Rome, that women weren't just meek and in the background and pulling strings very quietly, but they were out there in the front being this cool ass woman with a sword and killing men and you know
Yeah, it's a recent phenomenon because you weren't getting antiquarians 150 years ago saying female gladiators existed and they were cool. This is a modern thing. And I think it's a modern phenomenon to kind of make it appear bigger than it actually was. And part of it is historical rubbernecking. The arena was odd, it's alien, so we're going to emphasize how alien it is because that's easier and lazier than truly trying to understand what was going on there. But a lot of it is because of feminism, and feminism, particularly in ancient world studies, has kind of pushed in the last couple of decades for the lives of ancient women to have more attention, which can only ever be a good thing. And there's other facets of the way that the study in the field is going that also wants to emphasize how the lives of the poor were lived, um, how enslaved people lived and died. All of this is what we call history from below. We're looking at not just the great men. Forget Julius Caesar for a minute. Let's talk about people that we don't know the names of, and let's try and recreate as much as we can because those people lived and mattered too, which is great. Every classics is a bit late to the party on this, I think, to be honest. And it's great that we're finally catching up. That doesn't mean that we should take stories that we know from enslaved people or women or other, oppressed peoples and try and make them something that they weren't, just so that we can feel better, I guess, about their lived experiences. I think it's fine to look at these lives of, for instance, these aristocratic women who had, let's face it, probably the worst day of their lives. I think it's fine to look at them and instead of trying to glorify them to what? Make our make our own selves feel better about the fact that they had an appalling day. I think it's fine to read the words of these ancient writers and think, oh wow, it was even worse for some of these women than we imagine. Us trying and to say that these things didn't happen or happened in a much better way than we first assumed, that's not doing these women any favors, and it's not good history really. It's bad historical practice. I think we need to look at this and instead of thinking, yeah, feminists, women can do anything that a man can, I think that we should actually be looking at it and thinking, oh wow, patriarchy sucks and has done for a long time.
I totally agree. I feel really sad for these. Even though they did live a life of privilege, for example,
Yeah,
at the end of the day, they were silenced and they still didn't have a voice. So women were still experiencing. I'm not going to say the same thing because they weren't, but they were still experiencing that patriarchy. It didn't
yeah.
matter if you were a slave or wherever.
What I find really interesting is that there's a trend of seeing gladiators as victims. And there will be certain documentaries, for instance, and I'm naming no names, where the presenter or the narrator will say in a very solemn voice, this was a machine of death. The Colosseum was a conveyor belt of gore. And the poor men who were murdered within it. That kind of presentation is, again, it's a very modern thing. The Romans would have thought we were absolute pansies talking about the Colosseum that way. That's a modern thing to say these men were fighting for the entertainment, which is, again, is a bit of a generalization, fighting just purely for the entertainment of a bloodthirsty crowd. Again, it ignores the purpose of gladiation. And thinking about it that way, thinking of them all as victims, some of them undoubtedly were. They were bought in a slave market. They didn't get any choice about going into the arena. And some of them probably had a very short, unpleasant, and brutal career. But some of them managed to change their stars by becoming gladiators and were able to retire with money, which is would have been unheard of in other facets of Roman life. So I'm not saying that enslavement is good and being bought by a gladiatorial trainer is necessarily good. What I'm saying, it wasn't necessarily the worst thing that could possibly happen to you. It also ignores the fact that from quite an early period, from Augustus onwards, the percentage of enslaved people in each gladiatorial school, each ludus, was getting lower and lower. Because if you were a normal Roman, a citizen who had perhaps a bit of an attention seeking vibe, or you were just, like an adrenaline junkie, you might want to sign up because it looks like a hell of a lot of fun. Or if you were absolutely broke and owed a load of money, you could lease yourself out for a year, say, or a couple of years, and all your winnings could be used to pay off your debts. So there were people saying, you know what, I will do 1 to 5 years for you as a gladiator. I'll make you money, I'll take some money, and then I'll go, I'll be on my way. So there were a lot of people signing up for this, and they were called auctorati. So there were a lot of volunteers. So, on one hand, we've got a modern habit of seeing all male gladiators as victims, even if most of them absolutely didn't see themselves that way. And conversely, we're seeing all women in the arena not only as gladiators, but as feminist have a go heroes, when the vast majority of them were victims. So we've got it completely the wrong way round.
Before we finish, if you were to be a female gladiator, what would your name be?
That's a hard question, isn't it? Um, I don't know. I can always answer this question when it's male gladiators because my favourite name is Hector because I love me a bit of Eric Banner. I don't know if I was a girl, to be honest. Um, I'm gonna have to think about that. I do like Achillea. I think I'd probably go for Penthesilea instead of Amazon. I'd go for the full Penthesilea.
I don't know what I'd go for. Um,
It's worth mentioning in the West, they didn't use myth names as much. They would choose something like strength or speedy or there's one name that means nimble, for instance. So you would choose something that would advertise what you were good at, and that's what your name would be.
okay,
So it's,
Medusa then for me. It's got to be.
oh, that's a good one.
Turn men to stone.
Yeah, that
That
is a
is
good
not what I
one.
actually do, just in case somebody thinks I do that. I don't do that. But it'd be a good, useful skill though. If someone really pisses you off, there you go.
Oh, wouldn't it just? There would be so many statues in the area around where I live.
Or you can always go down the road. You could be my. I don't know. I'm trying to figure out the female version. So I'm trying to say Midasea.
Oh, I don't know, Medea? No, well, Medea was someone entirely different who also had, a very high body count after she was done. So, yeah, why not Medea? She killed more children than she did adults, but.
Oh my days. Listen, it has been such a pleasure to get you back on. We need to get you on again at some point in the future. And when is this book going to come out? When are you going to write your first book?
Well, if any publishers are listening, I would love to write a book about gladiators. And I am in the process of drafting up something. So keep your eyes peeled. We'll see.
Just a little bit of housekeeping. Remember, leave us a 5-star review on Apple. We do have that new website at www.historyhack.co.uk. Don't forget you can buy us a drink on Ko-fi. Like I said, need those shelves pretty soon. Also, feel free to subscribe to our Patreon account, which is www.patreon.co.uk/historyhack. You can go and have dinner with Chris. He is a cheap date, so don't worry, a good McDonald's will do. Or you could just take him down to Tesco's, either way. Listen, I'm going to leave you all with a fabulous dad joke yet again. So, how do you make a tissue dance? Put a little boogie in it. Thanks so much, guys.